My name is Bill Davidson, and this happened to me and my family back in the summer of 1973. I still get chills thinking about those 3 days in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if anyone would believe our story, but every word I'm about to tell you is true. I was a coal miner back then, had been for 15 years. My wife Mary, bless her heart, always worried about me going down into those dark mines every day. We had 2 kids, Tommy, my boy, who was 17 and loved to draw, and Rose, my little girl, 15 going on 30 with how mature she acted. That summer, we decided to take our first real family vacation. I'd saved up enough to buy a used 1971 Winnebago Brave. Nothing fancy, mind you, but it was our ticket to adventure. Mary packed enough sandwiches and snacks to feed an army, Tommy brought his sketchbooks, and Rose had her collection of mystery novels. We were just a normal family looking for some fun. If only I'd known what was waiting for us in those mountains. If only I'd paid more attention to the signs. But how could any of us have guessed that a wrong turn would lead us straight into something that science can't explain and reason can't justify? Let me take you back to that first day, when our simple family vacation turned into a nightmare that would change us forever. It was a hot Thursday afternoon when things started to go wrong. We were supposed to be heading to a nice campground near Blue Creek, but somehow our map wasn't making sense anymore. The roads kept getting narrower, and the trees seemed to grow taller and darker with each mile. "Dad, I think we missed a turn back there," Tommy said, looking up from his sketchbook. He was right. I hadn't seen any proper road signs for at least an hour. Mary was getting nervous. I could tell by the way she kept checking her watch. "Bill, maybe we should turn back? These roads don't look safe for the RV." I was about to agree when Rose suddenly sat up straight in her seat. "Does anyone else feel strange?" she asked, rubbing her arms like she was cold, even though it was nearly 90 degrees outside. That's when we saw it. An old, collapsed mine entrance tucked into the mountainside. Being a miner myself, I knew this wasn't on any of my maps. The whole valley felt wrong somehow. The trees were too quiet. No birds singing. No squirrels running around. Just silence. We parked the RV to check our bearings, and that's when Tommy pointed to something that made my blood run cold. There were rocks near the mine entrance, but they weren't normal rocks. They looked like faces. Dozens of them, carved by nature but too perfect to be accidents. "Look," Rose whispered, pointing to a figure moving between the trees. It was an old man, his clothes ragged and dirty. He was walking toward us, shaking his head. "You folks need to leave," he called out, his voice rough like gravel. "This here's Mothman's hunting ground. Ain't safe after dark, and dark's coming soon." I wanted to laugh it off. Tell my family he was just some crazy old hermit. But there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't joking. And as the sun started to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees, I realized we might have stumbled into something bigger than a wrong turn. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of our nightmare. I tried to start the RV to get us out of there, but it just wouldn't turn over. The engine made a weird clicking sound, and all the dashboard lights started flickering. Strange thing was, we had just filled up the tank and checked everything before the trip. "Dad," Tommy's voice shook a little, "you need to see this." He was holding up his sketchbook, and what I saw made my hands freeze on the steering wheel. He had drawn the exact mine entrance we were parked in front of, but in his drawing, it was collapsing. The scary part? He had drawn this 2 days ago, before we even left home. The sun was setting fast now, and the temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer door. Mary grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "Bill, look at the rear-view mirror." I did, and my heart nearly stopped. 2 red dots, like eyes, were glowing in the darkness behind our RV. They were too high up to be from any normal animal, maybe 10 feet off the ground. When I turned around to look directly, there was nothing there. But in the mirror, those eyes were still watching. Rose started getting a nosebleed, something that had never happened to her before. As she held a tissue to her nose, she started talking in a weird, quiet voice. "The ground is going to shake. The walls will fall. Just like before. Just like before." That's when we heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It was like huge wings flapping, but stronger than any bird I'd ever heard. The whole RV shook, and the moon disappeared for a few seconds, like something massive had flown between us and the sky. Our phones weren't working, the radio just gave off static, and every time we tried to drive away, we somehow ended up back at that mine entrance. It was like the valley didn't want to let us go. "We need to figure out what's happening," Mary said, trying to stay calm for the kids. "Bill, you worked in mines for years. Does anything about this place seem familiar to you?" I was about to answer when Tommy suddenly grabbed his pencil and started drawing again, his hand moving so fast it barely seemed to touch the paper. What he was drawing made my stomach turn. It was a scene of disaster, but it hadn't happened yet. Tommy's drawing showed miners trapped underground, with today's date scribbled in the corner. But what scared me most was that I recognized the place. It was the new Harrison mine, about 5 miles from where we were stuck. I had worked there before switching to a different site last year. "Something bad is going to happen there," Rose whispered, her nose still bleeding. "I can feel it. The Mothman. He's trying to warn us." Just then, our radio crackled to life by itself. Through the static, we could hear bits of what sounded like tomorrow's news. Tragic mining accident, collapse, miners trapped. Mary started putting the pieces together. "Bill, remember those stories your grandfather used to tell? About a creature that appeared before disasters? What if?" Before she could finish, the temperature dropped even more. Our breath came out in white puffs, even though it was summer. The windows of our RV started fogging up, and when Rose wiped a clear spot to look out, she screamed. There it was, standing in the moonlight, a huge, dark shape with wings spread wide. Its eyes glowed red like hot coals, and even though it had no face, we all felt it was trying to tell us something. Tommy's hand was moving again, drawing frantically. This time, the picture showed a clock, 10:30 a.m., and the Harrison mine entrance crumbling. "We have to warn them," I said, checking my watch. It was 2 a.m. "We have less than 8 hours to stop this." But when we tried to leave again, something strange happened. We'd drive for what felt like minutes, only to find ourselves back at the same spot. It was like time itself was playing tricks on us. "Look at these patterns," Mary said, pointing to some marks on the ground near the old mine entrance. "They're not random. They're pointing somewhere." That's when we realized the Mothman wasn't trying to scare us. It was trying to show us something that might help us save those miners' lives. We followed the strange marks on the ground, using our flashlights. They led us to the old mine entrance, and I noticed something odd. There were old warning signs in a pattern I'd never seen before. Mary started taking pictures of them with her camera. "Dad," Tommy called out suddenly. "I feel weird. Like I've been here before." He started walking in circles, looking confused. "I keep seeing the same moment over and over in my head. Miners running, lights flashing, someone yelling about support beams." Rose grabbed my hand, her face pale. "Tommy's stuck," she said quietly. "He's seeing what happened in the past and what's going to happen today. The Mothman's showing him." Just then, our flashlights started flickering, and that wing sound came back, louder this time. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. Through the darkness, I saw those red eyes again, and they seemed to be looking right at me. "Bill," Mary's voice shook as she showed me her camera. "Look at these warning signs. They're the same ones they use at Harrison Mine, and there's something written in the dust." Before she could finish, Tommy fell to his knees, clutching his head. "I can see it clearly now. At 10:30, the main support beam in Section C is going to crack. They won't hear it in time. We have to tell them." We tried to run back to the RV, but everything looked different now. The trees seemed to move on their own, and paths that were there a minute ago disappeared. It was like the forest itself was changing. "We're running out of time," Rose whispered, her nose starting to bleed again. "The Mothman. It's trying to help us find a way out, but something's fighting against us, something that wants the disaster to happen." I looked at my watch, 3:15 a.m. We had just over 7 hours to break free from whatever was holding us here and reach the Harrison mine. But first, we had to figure out why we kept getting pulled back to this spot. That's when I remembered something important from my mining days. Every old mine had a second exit, a safety tunnel. If we could find it, maybe we could break free from whatever was trapping us here. "Look at Tommy's drawings again," Mary said, her hands shaking as she held the sketchbook. Each page seemed to tell a story, the old mine, the new mine, and something connecting them underground. Rose touched the mine wall and jerked her hand back like it was hot. "I can feel them," she whispered. "The miners from before. They used another way out. Through there." She pointed to what looked like solid rock, but when I shined my flashlight, I saw thin cracks forming a door shape. We heard that wing sound again, and suddenly, all our flashlights pointed at the same spot. The Mothman was helping us, guiding our lights. There it was, an old wooden door hidden behind years of dust and rocks. But as soon as we found it, Tommy started acting strange. He walked in circles, saying the same things over and over. "The beam will crack. Section C 1030. The beam will crack." It was like he was stuck in a loop, just like we were stuck in this valley. "We need to snap him out of it," Mary said, trying to hold Tommy still. "Rose, honey, can you help him? You seem to understand what's happening." Rose took Tommy's hand, but then she froze too. Their eyes went wide, staring at something we couldn't see. The air got so cold I could see our breath, and that's when the really scary part started. The walls began to show moving shadows, like we were watching an old movie of miners, running, screaming silently. It was like time was breaking apart around us, showing us bits of the past and future all mixed together. I checked my watch again, 4:20 a.m. Time was running out, and now both my kids seemed trapped in whatever power held this place. We had to find a way to save them and warn the Harrison mine before it was too late. Mary grabbed our kids' hands and started singing their favorite lullaby, something she used to do when they were little. Slowly, Tommy and Rose blinked, coming back to us. But they looked different now, older somehow, like they'd seen things no kid should see. "Dad," Rose said quietly, "I know how to help Tommy now, and I know why we're stuck here. The Mothman isn't trapping us, time is. This place is like a loop. Bad things keep happening, because nobody can get out to warn others." I used my old mining skills to get that wooden door open. Behind it was a tunnel, surprisingly well kept for its age. As we stepped inside, our flashlights showed old rail tracks leading somewhere deep into the mountain. "Look," Tommy said, his voice stronger now. He pointed to some marks on the wall. They were dates. The last one was from a mining accident 30 years ago. These aren't just dates, they're warnings that never made it out. The wing sound came again, but this time it felt different, more urgent. The red eyes appeared at the end of the tunnel, like they were showing us the way. "Bill?" Mary grabbed my arm. "It's 5:45 a.m. We're running out of time." We started following the tracks, but then something terrifying happened. The tunnel behind us started to collapse, not with rocks and dust, but with darkness itself, like time was being erased. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Rose's hand while Mary held onto Tommy. We ran faster than we ever had, following those red eyes through the twisting tunnel. The darkness kept coming, swallowing everything behind us. Then Tommy stopped suddenly, pointing ahead. "There, I can see it, where the old tunnel meets the new mine." But he looked scared. Something's waiting for us there, something that doesn't want us to stop what's coming. At the end of the tunnel, we found ourselves facing something I still have trouble explaining. It was like a wall of moving shadows, with scenes playing across it like a broken movie, mining accidents from different times, all happening over and over. 6:30 a.m., Mary whispered. checking her watch. The shadows seemed to react to her voice, swirling faster. Tommy stepped forward, his hand shaking as he held up his sketchbook. "It's showing us all the disasters it couldn't stop," he said. "But look, they're all connected to the Harrison mine somehow." Rose's nose started bleeding again, worse than before. "We have to go through it," she said, wiping her nose. "The Mothman's been trying to break this cycle for years. That's why it brought us here. We're the first ones who can see what it sees." Those red eyes appeared again, and this time they were right next to us. The Mothman's wings spread wide, like it was trying to protect us from the shadow wall. "Hold hands," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Nobody let go, no matter what. As we stepped into the shadows, it felt like ice running through our bodies. We saw flashes of other families, other warnings, other failures. But something was different this time. Rose was glowing slightly, like she was lighting the way through. "Almost there," she said in a strange voice. "I can feel the new mine. We're going to make it." But then Tommy screamed. The shadows were pulling him back, trying to trap him in the time loop like all the others. "Not my son," Mary yelled, holding on to him tighter. "Not this time." What happened next changed our lives forever. Rose suddenly let out a gasp and reached for Tommy with her free hand. The moment she touched him, a bright light burst from where they connected. The shadows backed away like they were afraid of it. 7:15 a.m., I said, checking my watch. "We're running out of time." We burst through the shadow wall and found ourselves in a newer tunnel, one I recognized from the Harrison mine. The air smelled fresher here, and we could hear distant voices of miners starting their morning shift. "There's Section C," I pointed. "But something's wrong, Tommy, Rose. They look sick." Both kids were pale, and Rose's nose wouldn't stop bleeding. Tommy kept drawing the same thing over and over, the clock showing 10:30 and the cracking beam. "The shadows," Rose whispered. "They're still trying to pull us back. But I can hold them off. I understand now. This is what the Mothman's been trying to do all along. Find someone who can break the cycle." 8 a.m., Mary announced, her voice shaking. "We need to warn them now." I started running toward the mine office, but stopped when I heard Rose cry out. She was holding on to Tommy, who looked like he was fading away, like he was becoming part of the shadows himself. "No!" Rose shouted. "I won't let you take him." A bright light started growing around Rose, getting stronger and stronger. Those red eyes appeared one last time, watching as something incredible began to happen. The light around Rose grew so bright we had to shield our eyes. When it faded, Tommy was solid again. But Rose, she was different. Her eyes had a faint red glow, just like the Mothman's. "I understand everything now," she said in a voice that sounded both young and ancient. "This is what was meant to happen. I'm the new warning system." 9 a.m., Mary cried, tears running down her face. "Bill, go! You know these miners. They'll listen to you." I ran to the mine office, burst through the door, and found my old friend Jack Wilson, the safety supervisor. "Jack, you have to evacuate Section C now. The main beam is going to collapse." He knew me, trusted me, but still looked doubtful. "Bill, what are you doing here? We just checked those supports yesterday." That's when Rose walked in, her eyes still glowing faintly. She held up Tommy's drawings and started describing exactly how the beam would fail. As she spoke, the lights in the office flickered, and everyone felt that same cold we'd experienced in the old mine. 10:15 a.m., Tommy whispered, looking at his watch. Jack grabbed a radio. "All miners in Section C evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. I repeat, evacuate immediately." We all stood there, watching the clock tick toward 10:30. The miners were climbing out, confused but following orders. At exactly 10:30, we heard a distant crack, followed by a rumble. Section C collapsed, but every single miner was safe. "You did it, Rose," Tommy said, hugging his sister. "You broke the cycle." But we all knew things would never be the same. Rose had changed. The Mothman had chosen her as its successor, to continue warning others of dangers to come. "Don't worry," Rose said, hugging us. "I'm still me. I'm just more now. And I'll be here to help others, just like the Mothman helped us." That was 12 years ago. We still live in West Virginia, but things are different now. Rose isn't with us all the time. She appears when she's needed, just like the Mothman did. Sometimes we see her in our dreams, warning us about things to come. Tommy became an artist. He draws pictures that help Rose warn people. His gallery is full of drawings that tell stories of disasters prevented, floods, fires, accidents. People don't know the real story behind his art, but they feel something special when they look at it. Mary keeps a special room in our house for Rose, even though it's usually empty. Sometimes late at night, we find fresh flowers on the windowsill, Rose's way of telling us she's watching over us. As for me, I retired from mining but started working as a safety consultant. When Rose sends me warnings through Tommy's drawings, I know exactly where to go and who to talk to. Last week, I saw those red eyes again, but I wasn't scared this time. It was just Rose, checking in on her family. She stood in our backyard, wings spread wide, looking just like the Mothman did that night. But her smile, that was still our little girl's smile. "The cycle is broken," she told me before disappearing into the night. "But there will always be people who need warnings, who need help. That's why I'm here." Some nights, when the moon is full, you can see two shapes flying over the Appalachian Mountains, the old Mothman and its chosen successor, my daughter Rose, both watching, both warning, both protecting. And if you're ever driving through those mountains and see red eyes in your rearview mirror, don't be afraid. It might just be my Rose, making sure you get home safe. My name is John Blackwood, and this happened to me back in 1979. I still get chills thinking about those 3 days in Monument Valley, but I need to tell this story to warn others, maybe, or just to finally get it out. I was fresh out of Vietnam then, still jumping at loud noises and waking up screaming some nights. The war had left its marks on me, both inside and out, but I was trying to build a new life. That's when I met Catherine at a support group for veterans and their families. She was there because her brother had served too. She had a 13-year-old daughter, Emily, from her previous marriage. Catherine was like sunshine after a long storm, warm, bright, and healing. We got married after 6 months of dating. Emily, though, well, she was struggling with having a new dad, especially one who sometimes zoned out or got angry over small things. I couldn't blame her. That summer, I had this brilliant idea to take them on an RV trip. You know, one of those family bonding things you see in magazines. We bought a used 1977 Winnebago Chieftain. Not the prettiest thing, but it was home for what we planned would be a 2-week adventure through the Southwest. Everything was going fine until we hit Monument Valley. The red rocks were beautiful in the sunset, but something felt off. Maybe it was my soldier instincts kicking in, or maybe it was something else. I just knew that when our RV started making those weird noises and finally broke down on that lonely stretch of road near the Navajo reservation, we were in for trouble. I had no idea then just how right I was, or that my war experiences would end up being the very thing that helped us survive what was coming. Little Emily found something in the dirt that evening, a small leather pouch with strange symbols on it. That's when everything changed. That's when the nightmares became real. You probably won't believe what I'm about to tell you. Most days, I hardly believe it myself. But every word is true. And it all started with those glowing yellow eyes in the darkness. That first night, I was trying to fix our RV as the sun went down. Catherine was inside making sandwiches, and Emily was playing nearby, kicking rocks around. That's when I heard her excited voice. "John! Look what I found," Emily called out, holding up a small, dirty leather pouch. It was about the size of her palm, with faded symbols stitched into it. Looking back now, I should have told her to leave it alone. Just then, an old Native American man in a dusty pickup truck stopped by. His face got real serious when he saw where we were parked. "You folks need to leave," he said quietly, looking at the darkening sky. "You're on the bad path. Not safe here after dark." I tried to explain about our broken-down RV, but he kept shaking his head. "The skinwalkers hunt here," he said. "Evil spirits that wear animal skins. They trick you, make you hear things that aren't real." Catherine came out then, asking what was wrong. The old man looked at Emily, who was still holding that pouch, and his eyes got wide. "Where did you find that?" he asked sharply. When Emily pointed to the ground, he stepped back. "That's a seal. Breaking it, it calls them." He offered to tow us to town, but our RV was too heavy for his truck. Before leaving, he gave us some sage to burn and told us to stay inside, no matter what we heard. We laughed it off at first. Catherine made jokes about scary campfire stories as we ate dinner, but then night fell, and the coyotes started howling. Except they weren't normal coyotes. The sounds were coming from too high up, like they were standing on two legs. And when I shined my flashlight out the window, I saw them, a circle of what looked like coyotes, but wrong. They were walking upright, and their eyes were glowing yellow in the darkness. Emily screamed. Catherine grabbed her. And I felt that same cold fear I hadn't felt since Vietnam, because these weren't regular animals, they were something else. Something that shouldn't exist. And they were watching us. The night was just beginning, and somehow I knew that little medicine pouch had started something terrible. Something that wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. None of us slept that first night. We huddled together in the RV's small bedroom, jumping at every sound. The worst part wasn't the coyotes anymore. It was the voices. Around midnight, I heard Catherine calling me from outside. John, please help, I'm hurt." My heart nearly stopped because I could see Catherine right next to me, her eyes wide with fear. The voice outside was exactly like hers, perfect in every way. Then we heard Emily's voice too. "Mommy? Daddy, let me in." But Emily was right there, clutching her mother's hand, tears running down her face. The scratching started next. Long, slow scrapes down the RV's sides. When morning finally came, we found deep claw marks in the metal, and something worse. Animal skins arranged in a circle around our RV, each one carefully laid out like a horrible welcome mat. Emily started acting strange that day. She kept staring into space and humming songs we'd never heard before. When Catherine tried to make her eat lunch, she spoke in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "They're hungry too, Mommy." I tried fixing the RV again, but my hands kept shaking. The war had taught me about enemies I could see, ones I could fight. But this was different. That afternoon, Catherine found some old newspaper clippings in the RV's glove compartment. A family of 4 had disappeared here exactly 10 years ago. Their RV was found empty, with claw marks down the sides. As the sun started setting again, Emily began sleepwalking toward the desert. Catherine caught her just in time, but when we pulled her back, there were small bleeding cuts on her arms, like something had been trying to drag her away. I burned the sage like the old man told us, but the smoke only made shapes that looked like dancing figures on the walls. Catherine started crying when she found similar cuts appearing on her own arms. And me? My war flashbacks were getting worse. But instead of jungle sounds, I kept hearing that evil laughter from outside. It knew about the things I'd seen in Vietnam. Somehow, it was using my memories against me. Night was coming again, and we all knew tonight would be worse. Much worse. The second night was when everything got really bad. Emily wouldn't stop chanting in her sleep, words that sounded ancient and wrong. Her eyes would open sometimes, but they weren't her eyes anymore. They had turned yellow, just like those things outside. Catherine found some old cave paintings in a book she'd brought along. They showed the same symbols that were on that leather pouch Emily had found. According to the book, these creatures, the skinwalkers, could only be stopped by a special ritual. But the price was high. It needed someone to offer their own life force to save anyone possessed. Around midnight, Emily sat straight up in bed and spoke in a deep, growling voice. "The moon turns red tomorrow, then she'll be ours forever." I was trying to stay strong, but my PTSD kept kicking in. Every shadow looked like a Vietnam ambush, every sound like gunfire. But then I realized something. Maybe my war experience wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was preparing me for this fight all along. We heard slithering sounds on the RV's roof. Through the skylight, we could see something crawling around up there, something that kept changing shape. First a coyote, then a bear, then something that looked almost human, but wrong. Catherine started getting weaker as the cuts on her arms grew worse, but she kept reading that book, desperate to find a way to save Emily. "The ritual has to be done in their sacred cave," she told me, her voice shaking. "During the blood moon, it's our only chance." Emily's sleepwalking got worse. We had to tie her to the bed with sheets, which broke my heart. But the worst part was when she looked at us with those yellow eyes and smiled, a smile that showed too many teeth. Just before dawn, we heard a new sound, drums. Deep, ancient drums coming from somewhere in the desert. And Emily's body rose up, floating above the bed, still tied in those sheets. Her voice mixed with something else's as she said, "Tomorrow, when the moon bleeds, the harvest begins." I held Catherine as she cried. We both knew we had one day left to save our daughter, one day to prepare for a fight against something that wasn't human. And somewhere out there was a cave where it would all end, one way or another. The final day felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end. We found the cave early in the morning. There were claw marks and those same symbols from the pouch carved all around its entrance. Catherine was so weak she could barely walk, but she memorized every word of that ritual while I gathered what we needed: sage, salt, and something personal from each of us. Emily kept switching between herself and whatever was trying to take her. In her normal moments, she'd cry and tell us she was scared. Then her eyes would go yellow again, and that other voice would come out, laughing and making threats. As the sun started to set, the moon began rising, big and red like a giant bloodstain in the sky. That's when Emily broke free from her ropes like they were made of paper. She ran straight toward the cave, moving in a way that wasn't natural, like a puppet on strings. We chased her inside. The cave was huge and dark with tunnels going deep into the earth. Our flashlights showed more cave paintings. They seemed to move in the shadows, telling stories of other families, other victims. Then we saw it, the skinwalker in its true form. I can't really describe it. It kept changing, like smoke that couldn't decide what shape to be. But those yellow eyes stayed the same, and that smile, that horrible smile full of teeth. Catherine started the ritual, her voice echoing off the cave walls. The skinwalker screamed, a sound that brought back every terrible memory from Vietnam. But this time, I used those memories. Every battle I'd fought, every fear I'd faced, it all made me stronger. Emily was floating again, her body glowing with a sickly light. Catherine's voice grew weaker as the ritual went on. She was giving up her own life force, just like the book said. I could see her getting paler, fading away almost. I fought the creature while Catherine chanted. It kept changing forms, trying to trick me, using the voices of dead friends from the war. But I knew its game now. The real battle wasn't physical, it was in our minds. What happened next? That's the hardest part to tell. The final battle in that cave felt like it lasted forever. Catherine's voice was getting weaker with each word of the ritual. But something amazing was happening. Emily started fighting back from the inside. "Daddy!" she screamed in her real voice, fighting against whatever was controlling her. "Mommy, I can feel it getting weaker." The skinwalker let out this horrible shriek and lunged at Catherine. But I was ready. All those years of combat training kicked in. I threw the salt in a circle around us, just like the book said. The creature couldn't cross it. Then Emily did something incredible. She started crying. But these weren't normal tears. They were glowing with a pure, bright light. The book had mentioned something about this, a child's innocence being like poison to these evil spirits. Catherine was almost transparent now, her life force draining away as she finished the ritual. The skinwalker began to melt like wax under a flame. Those yellow eyes turned black, then disappeared completely. But we were losing Catherine. She looked at Emily and me one last time and whispered, "I love you both." Then she collapsed. Just when I thought we'd lost her forever, Emily ran to her mom and hugged her tight. Those glowing tears fell on Catherine's face, and something miraculous happened. Color started coming back to her cheeks. She wasn't gone after all. Emily's innocence hadn't just helped defeat the skinwalker, it had saved her mother too. We got out of that cave just as the sun was rising. The red moon was gone, and so were all the claw marks on our RV. Later that day, a mechanic drove by and fixed our engine like nothing had ever happened. But things weren't the same after that. Emily could see things other people couldn't. She called it her special sight. Catherine and I grew closer than ever. And me? Those war memories don't haunt me anymore. After facing a skinwalker, regular nightmares don't seem so scary. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we hear coyotes howling in the distance. Normal coyotes, mind you, the four-legged kind, but we always burn a little sage, just in case. And that leather pouch? We buried it deep in the desert, marked with warnings in every language we knew. Some people don't believe our story, and that's okay. But if you're ever driving through Monument Valley and your car breaks down as the sun sets, don't pick up anything you find on the ground, and whatever you do, don't stay on the bad path after dark. Because even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and think I see yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. And I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for another family to break down on that lonely stretch of road. My name is Peter Reynolds, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1965, when I was 16. It's a story I've never shared with anyone outside my family. Honestly, most people wouldn't believe it anyway. But everything I'm about to tell you is true, every single terrifying moment of it. I had a twin brother, Michael. We were living in Detroit back then with our parents, George and Martha. Dad worked at the old car factory, just like most other dads in our neighborhood. Life was simple, normal even, until the factory shut down. I still remember that evening Dad came home, his face pale and hands shaking, telling Mom they were closing everything down. We tried to make it work in Detroit for a few months, but things just got worse. Then one day, Dad came home with this crazy idea. He'd bought an old yellow school bus for cheap and wanted to convert it into an RV. "We'll head up north," he said, his eyes bright with hope for the first time in months. "My cousin in northern Michigan says they're always hiring at the lumber mills there." Mom wasn't too happy at first, but what choice did we have? So we spent 2 months turning that old bus into our home. Dad and I built beds in the back. Mike helped Mom set up a tiny kitchen area, and we even managed to fit in a small bathroom. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. If only we knew what was waiting for us in those northern woods. If only we'd taken the main highway instead of that shortcut through Black Woods. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly how it all started, on that warm June evening when our lives changed forever. We left Detroit early morning, all excited about our new adventure. Mom had packed sandwiches, and Mike and I were playing cards in the back of our bus-turned RV. Everything was going fine until around 6 in the evening, when Dad decided to take a shortcut. "This forest road will save us 3 hours, Dad said, pointing to a worn-out map. Mom didn't look too sure, but Dad was always the one who knew about directions. The moment we turned onto that dirt road, something felt different. The trees seemed to grow thicker and closer together. The sunlight that was bright just minutes ago now barely made it through the branches. Mike and I stopped our card game and just stared out the windows. "It's getting dark really fast," Mike whispered to me. He was right. It wasn't even 7 p.m., but it looked like night was falling. That's when our bus started making weird noises. Not the normal engine sounds, but something that made Dad frown and grip the steering wheel tighter. "George, maybe we should turn back," Mom said softly. But Dad shook his head. "We're already halfway through. No point turning back now." Then it happened. Dad slammed on the brakes so hard that Mike and I fell forward. Mom let out a small scream. There, in the middle of the road, standing in our headlights, was something I'll never forget. At first, I thought it was a bear, but bears don't stand 9 feet tall. Bears don't have eyes that glow like burning coals, and bears definitely don't look at you like they know exactly what you're thinking. What is that?" Mike's voice was shaking. None of us moved. None of us breathed. The creature just stood there staring at our bus. Its fur was darker than the shadows around it, and its shape, it was like a wolf, but wrong. All wrong. Then it smiled. I didn't know animals could smile, but this one did. And that's when I saw the teeth. Those teeth, they weren't like any animals I'd ever seen. They looked almost human, but sharper, bigger. The creature took one step toward our bus, and that's when Dad did something I'll never forget. He honked the horn, just one long, loud blast. For a second, nothing happened. Then the creature's head snapped to the side, like it heard something we couldn't. And just like that, it disappeared into the darkness. Not ran, not walked, just vanished. "Everyone okay?" Dad's voice was trying to sound calm, but I could hear the shake in it. We all nodded, too scared to speak. That's when we saw the sign. It wasn't there before, I swear it wasn't. But now, in our headlights, we could all see it clearly, a wooden board nailed to a tree. "Turn back. They hunt at night." Mom started crying quietly. "George, please, let's turn around." Dad tried to start the bus, but the engine just made a sick coughing sound. He tried again. Nothing. "It's okay," he said, not looking at any of us. "I'll just check under the hood. Probably just overheated." "No," Mike and I said at the same time. Sometimes being twins means you think the same thing. But Dad was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'll be quick. Just 5 minutes. Lock the doors behind me." We watched as Dad got out, flashlight in hand. The beam looked so small in all that darkness. He lifted the hood, and we could see him leaning in, checking things. That's when we heard it, a howl. But not like any wolf howl I'd ever heard. This one made my whole body go cold. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Dad's flashlight beam started shaking. "Dad!" Mom screamed, but her voice seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. "George, get back inside!" We saw Dad's flashlight swing around wildly, and then it dropped. The light rolled under the bus, leaving everything in darkness except for that one beam pointing at nothing. That's when the scratching started. Not on the bus, in our heads. It felt like something was trying to get inside our minds. Mike grabbed my hand, and suddenly I could feel what he was feeling too. Fear, but also something else, like we were connecting to whatever was out there. "Peter," Mike whispered, "can you feel them too?" I nodded. Through the windows, we could see shadows moving. Not normal shadows. These were darker than dark, and they were alive. They flowed around the bus like black water. Mom was trying to stay brave, but I could see her hands shaking as she reached for Dad's old baseball bat. "Boys," she said, "get in the back and stay quiet." But we couldn't move. The scratching in our heads was getting stronger. Through the windows, we could see more of them now. 7, maybe 8 huge shapes circling our bus. Their eyes glowed like burning coal in the darkness. Then, Mom saw something that made her gasp. On the trees around us, barely visible in the dim light, were strange markings. They looked ancient, like something carved hundreds of years ago. "Those symbols," she whispered, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "I've seen these before, in one of my history books." Another howl split the night, closer this time, much closer. And this one didn't just sound scary, it made my whole body freeze up. I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was like the howl itself was holding us in place. Then we heard footsteps approaching the bus. Heavy footsteps, but they weren't coming from where Dad had gone. We all held our breath as the footsteps got closer. Mom gripped the baseball bat tighter, and Mike and I pressed against each other in the back of the bus. Through the foggy windows, we could see a tall figure moving towards us. Martha. A voice called out. It sounded like Dad, but different. Wrong somehow. George? Mom's voice shook. Is that you? The figure came closer to the bus door. In the dim light, we could see it was Dad, but something wasn't right. He was standing weird, too straight, and his eyes. They looked strange. Let me in, Martha, he said. It's cold out here. Mike squeezed my hand hard. In my head, I could hear his thoughts as clear as day. That's not Dad. Mom must have felt it too because she didn't move to open the door. George, where's your flashlight? Dad, or whatever looked like Dad, smiled. It was the same kind of smile we'd seen on that creature earlier. I dropped it. Just let me in, Martha. The children need their father. That's when we heard another voice, a weak shout coming from somewhere in the woods behind us. Martha, don't open the door. That's not me. It was Dad's real voice. The thing at the door stopped smiling. Its face started to change, stretching in ways a face shouldn't stretch. Those coal-black eyes got bigger, darker. Mom backed away from the door, pushing us behind her. What did you do to my husband? She demanded, her voice stronger than I expected. The creature that wasn't Dad anymore let out a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a growl. And then it spoke, but not with Dad's voice anymore. The voice that came out wasn't human anymore. It was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together. Smart woman, it growled. But it won't save you. The twins, they're special. We can sense it. Mom swung the bat at the window. You stay away from my boys. The creature stepped back, but it was smiling again. That horrible too-many-teeth smile. You don't understand. Your boys are like us. They can feel it already, can't they? The connection? Mike and I looked at each other. He was right. Ever since we entered these woods, something had changed. We could feel the creature's thoughts, their hunger, their excitement. Mom, I whispered, Dad's still alive. I can feel him. He's scared, but okay. The creature's head snapped toward me. See? The boy knows. They both know. It pressed its face against the window. We've waited so long for ones like them. Suddenly, the whole bus shook. Something heavy had jumped onto the roof. We could hear claws scraping against metal. More shadows moved outside. The pack was closing in. The moon's almost right, the creature said, looking up at the sky. When it goes dark, we'll come for them. One will join us, one will die. That's how it's always been. Mom was reading something on her phone, her hands shaking. The runes, she muttered, they're not just markings. They're a warning about the choosing. Another howl filled the air, but this time, something weird happened. Mike and I both felt a pull in our minds, like the howl was calling to us. We could understand what it meant. They're saying, Mike started. It's starting, I finished. Through the trees, we could see the moon beginning to disappear. The moon was getting darker and darker. Mom's phone screen lit up her face as she kept reading about the runes, her hands shaking. Boys, she whispered, these markings, they're telling a story. Every 100 years they choose twins. One becomes one of them. The other. She couldn't finish the sentence. The creature outside wasn't pretending to be Dad anymore. It had grown taller, its shadow massive against our bus. More shapes moved in the darkness. The whole pack was here now. Mom. Mike suddenly grabbed his head. Something's happening. I felt it too, like someone was pulling at my brain, trying to fill it with images of running through the woods, hunting in the dark, being powerful and free. It felt good. And that scared me more than anything. Fight it, Mom said firmly. Both of you, fight it. That's when we heard Dad's real voice again, closer this time. "Martha, the eclipse, when it ends, that's when they're weakest." The creature roared, an angry sound that shook the whole bus. "Silence him!" But Mom had heard enough. "The eclipse," she said, checking her phone, "it lasts 7 minutes. We just need to hold on for 7 minutes after it goes completely dark." The moon was almost covered now. The woods had gone so dark we could barely see anything except those glowing eyes surrounding us. And now there was something else, whispers in our heads, getting louder. "Choose, choose, one must choose." Mike looked at me, his face pale. "Peter, if they take one of us—" "No," I cut him off. "They're not taking either of us." But as the last bit of moonlight disappeared, the bus door began to bend inward with a horrible screeching sound. The door burst open with a crash. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it a smell like wet fur and something rotten. Mom swung the bat, but it went right through the darkness like it was hitting smoke. "6 minutes," Mom shouted, looking at her phone. "Just hold on." The leader stepped into our bus. It was huge, so tall it had to bend down. Its fur looked like it was made of shadows, moving and swirling in the dark. Behind it, we could see Dad being held by 2 other creatures, but he was still fighting. "The time of choosing is now," the leader growled. "One twin to join our pack, one to feed our hunger. That is the balance." Mike grabbed my arm. We could both feel the pull getting stronger. In our heads, we saw flashes of running through the woods, being powerful, living forever. It was like the creatures were showing us what we could become. 5 minutes, Mom whispered. Suddenly, Mike stepped forward. "Take me." "No." I tried to pull him back, but he shook me off. "Peter, listen," he said quickly. "I can feel them better than you can. I'm stronger against them, if one of us has to." 4 minutes. Mom's voice shook. The leader reached for Mike with its huge claws. That's when something inside me snapped. All the fear turned into anger. I jumped forward and pushed Mike behind me. "You want one of us?" I shouted. "Then take me instead." The creature stopped. Its glowing eyes studied me. "The protective one," it growled. "Yes, your fear has turned to strength. You would make a worthy hunter." 3 minutes, Mom said. Then Dad's voice rang out. "The runes! Martha, read the runes!" Mom's hands were shaking as she read from her phone. "When blood calls to blood, and darkness claims the moon, the circle must remain unbroken. Only sacrifice freely given can break the hunter's curse." 2 minutes, she added, her voice getting stronger. The leader's eyes flashed with anger. "No, the words are not meant for human tongues." But something was happening. The runes on the trees outside started to glow with a faint blue light. The creatures holding Dad suddenly let go, howling in pain. "The curse," the leader snarled. "You're trying to break our curse." 1 minute, Mom shouted. Everything happened so fast then. Dad ran toward us. The leader lunged for Mike. I jumped between them, and in that moment, I understood what the runes meant. A sacrifice freely given, not a life, but a choice. "I choose," I yelled, "but not for power. I choose to protect, to keep others safe from you." A bright light burst from the runes, so bright it hurt to look at. The creatures screamed, not like animals, but like something ancient and angry. 30 seconds, Mom's voice seemed far away. The leader's form started breaking apart like smoke in the wind. "What have you done?" it howled. "The moon," Dad pointed through the bus window. The eclipse was ending. The first ray of moonlight hit the ground. And then, that first ray of moonlight changed everything. It was like watching smoke disappear in strong wind. The creatures started fading away, their howls getting weaker and weaker. The leader tried to grab me one last time, but its claws went right through me like a bad dream. "You've broken the cycle," it hissed as it faded. "But we'll be watching. We'll always be watching." Then it was gone. All of them were gone. The woods were suddenly quiet, normal quiet, with regular cricket sounds and wind in the trees. The awful pressure in our heads disappeared too. Dad ran to Mom and hugged her tight. Mike grabbed me, and we just stood there, shaking and holding each other. We were alive. We were all alive. The ruins, Mom said softly, looking out the window. They're gone too. She was right. The trees were just trees now. No glowing marks, no ancient warnings. Even the wooden sign that said "Turn back" had vanished. Dad got the bus started right away. It worked perfectly, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. We drove out of those woods as fast as we could. Nobody saying a word until we reached the main highway. That was 60 years ago. We did make it to northern Michigan, and Dad found work at the lumber mill. We never talked about that night to anyone else. Who would believe us? But sometimes, on dark nights when the moon is full, I still feel something calling to me from those woods. Mike feels it too. That's why we made a pact. Every year, we go back to the edge of Black Woods, not to enter, just to watch, to make sure the curse stays broken, to protect others who might take that shortcut. Because the leader was right about one thing, they're still watching. And sometimes, late at night, I hear distant howls that make my blood run cold, reminding me that some roads should stay untaken, and some shortcuts aren't worth the price. Last week, Mike and I made our yearly trip back to Black Woods. We're both in our 70s now, but we've never missed a year. This time was different though. As we parked at the edge of the woods, we saw a family in an RV pulling up to that same dirt road we took all those years ago. Their kids looked about 16, twins, just like we were. Before they could turn onto that road, I stepped out of our car and waved them down. The father rolled down his window, looking annoyed. "You don't want to go that way," I said quietly. "Road's not safe. There's a better route I can show you." The father started to argue, but then Mike joined me. Maybe it was something in our eyes, or maybe those kids felt something, like we did all those years ago. Whatever it was, they turned around. As they drove away, we heard it, a distant howl of frustration. Mike looked at me and nodded. The pack was still there, still waiting, still hungry. "They'll try again," Mike said. "They always do." "And we'll be here," I answered. "We always will be." That's why I'm telling this story now, because sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to share the truth. So if you're ever driving through northern Michigan and you see an unmarked forest road that looks like a shortcut, remember my story, remember the Black Woods, and keep driving. My name is Howard Thompson, and this happened to me in the summer of 1957. Even today, as I sit in my living room writing this, my hands shake when I think about what we experienced at Blackwater Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. I was 35 then, working as a bank manager in New Jersey. After getting a nice promotion, I decided to surprise my family with our first real vacation and a brand new Airstream trailer. My wife Betty wasn't too excited about camping. She preferred hotels with proper bathrooms. But our kids, Mike, 15, Sarah, 12, and little Tommy, 8, were over the moon about the idea of sleeping in a shiny silver trailer. The day we left was bright and sunny. Betty packed enough sandwiches to feed an army, and the kids were fighting over who'd get the best spots in the trailer. Mike, being a typical teenager, just wanted to read his comic books. Sarah couldn't stop talking about swimming in the lake. And Tommy. Well, Tommy was different from the start. He kept saying he could hear the lake calling even before we got there. I remember laughing it off then. Kids and their wild imaginations, right? If only I had listened more carefully to Tommy's words that day. If only I had known what was waiting for us in those dark waters of Blackwater Lake. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs. The way the other drivers kept their distance from our trailer on the highway. The strange looks we got at gas stations when we mentioned where we were heading. And that old man at the last diner who crossed himself when we said, Blackwater Lake. But I was too excited about our perfect family vacation to pay attention to any of that. too proud of my new Airstream, too sure of myself. That's how our story began. And believe me, what happened next changed our lives forever. We reached Blackwater Lake just as the sun was setting. The first thing that hit me was how quiet everything was. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the gentle splash of dark water against the shore. The campground was pretty empty, with only 3 other trailers parked far apart from each other. "Dad, this place feels weird," Sarah whispered as we pulled into our spot. I noticed she was holding Tommy's hand tighter than usual. Our campsite was right near the water's edge, under some old pine trees. As I was setting up the trailer, Betty started taking pictures with her new camera. She loved capturing family moments, but something caught her eye in one of the shots. "Howard, come look at this," she called out, her voice shaking a bit. The photo showed what looked like straight lines under the water, almost like streets. I told her it was probably just rocks or fallen trees, but deep down, something didn't feel right. That first night, we had hot dogs and marshmallows around the campfire. Everything seemed normal until Tommy pointed at the lake and said something that made my skin crawl. "The people in the water are watching us, Daddy." Mike laughed it off. "There's nobody in the water, Squirt. It's too dark to swim." But Tommy just stared at the lake, his face serious. "They're there. They're always there. And they're hungry." I was about to tell him to stop scaring his sister when we heard a splash, too big to be a fish. Betty grabbed my arm, and we all turned to look. The lake surface was as smooth as glass, but for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something that looked like a hand disappear beneath the water. "Time for bed," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. As we headed into the trailer, I noticed all the other campers had already gone inside their trailers too. It wasn't even 9 p.m. yet. That night, I lay awake listening to the water lapping against the shore. It sounded different somehow, not like normal waves, more like whispers. And every now and then I could hear Tommy talking in his sleep, using words that number 8-year-olds should know. The next morning, I decided to check out the local bait shop to get some fishing gear, trying to keep things normal. You know, the shop was an old wooden building that looked like it might fall over in a strong wind. The owner, Jake, was a skinny old man with white hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. "Camping by the lake, are you?" he asked while I was picking out some lures. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in days. "Yes, with my family," I replied. "Site 7, right by the water." Jake's hand froze while counting my change. "Site 7? That was where the old town hall used to be." "Used to be?" He looked around like he was making sure we were alone, then leaned in close. "This whole area was a town once, Blackwater Village. They flooded the valley in 22 to make the lake. Some folks say not everyone left in time." Just then, Betty burst into the shop, looking pale. "Howard, you need to see this." She was holding her camera with shaking hands. Back at the campsite, she showed me the photos she'd taken that morning. Most were normal, kids eating breakfast, the sunrise over the lake. But one picture made my stomach turn. It showed Tommy standing by the water's edge, and behind him, what looked like dozens of figures standing in the lake, their faces just below the surface, all staring at our sun. "It's just water ripples," I said, not believing my own words. "The light playing tricks." That's when Tommy came running up to us. "Dad, I made some new friends. They live in the church under the water. They want me to visit them tonight." Betty grabbed Tommy and held him tight. Sarah started crying, and Mike, for once, wasn't pretending to be too cool to be scared. As if things weren't strange enough, we started hearing bells ringing, deep, muffled bells, like they were coming from far away, or from deep under the water. And the strangest part? It was only 11 in the morning, but the sky had turned as dark as twilight. Things got worse as the day went on. Our trailer started acting strange. Water would drip from the ceiling even though it wasn't raining. The radio kept turning on by itself, playing old songs from the 1920s through static. And Tommy wasn't himself anymore. "Mother, shall we go to the social tonight?" he asked Betty at lunch, speaking in a way that sounded like an old movie. The ladies at the church are expecting us." Betty dropped her sandwich. "Howard," she whispered. "He sounds just like my grandfather in those old recordings." I decided to go to the town library to find out more about this place. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pierce, went pale when I mentioned where we were camping. "You need to see these," she said, pulling out a dusty folder of newspaper clippings from 1922. The headlines made my blood run cold. "Valley to be flooded, residents forced to relocate. Minister refuses to leave church, claims ancient evil must be contained. 12 children missing as waters rise." But what really got me was a photograph of Blackwater Village before the flood. There was our campsite, exactly where the town hall had stood, and next to it, a church with a tall spire. The same church Tommy kept talking about. When I got back to the campsite, I found Betty trying to calm down Sarah. The water in the sink turned black. Sarah sobbed. "And I saw faces in it, Dad. Children's faces." Mike, who had been reading in the trailer, came running out. "Something's wrong with Tommy. He's talking to someone who isn't there." We found Tommy sitting by the lake's edge, having what seemed like a conversation with the water. But what terrified me most was that the water was responding, rippling and splashing in patterns that almost sounded like words. "They're so hungry, Dad," Tommy said without turning around. "They've been hungry for such a long time." That's when we all heard it. The sound of a church bell ringing from beneath the lake, and children's laughter echoing across the water. The sun was setting, and in the fading light, I could see dark shapes moving under the surface, getting closer to the shore. I grabbed Tommy and pulled him away from the water, but he fought against me like never before. "They need me," he screamed. "They've been waiting for so long." Just then, our trailer's lights started flashing on and off. Water began pouring from every faucet, black as ink. The radio crackled to life again. But this time we heard children's voices singing an old hymn through the static. "We need to leave. Now," I yelled, trying to start our car. But it wouldn't work. The engine just made horrible gurgling sounds, like it was filled with water. That's when Betty noticed something that made us all freeze. The lake's water was slowly rising, creeping up the shore towards our trailer. But it wasn't normal water anymore. It was moving against the wind, like it had a mind of its own. "Look!" Sarah pointed at the lake. In the darkness, we could see lights shining from deep below, church windows glowing under the water. And shadows were moving inside them. Lots of shadows. "They're coming," Tommy said calmly. He had stopped fighting and stood very still. "They're coming because I invited them. They just want to play with me." Mike tried to grab his little brother, but Tommy's skin was ice cold. When he turned to look at us, his eyes had turned as dark as the lake water. "Tommy, honey," Betty reached for him crying, "please come back to us." The water was at our feet now, and I could hear what sounded like singing coming from beneath the surface. Not just children's voices, but adult voices too, an entire town's worth of voices calling out. "You don't understand," Tommy said, but it wasn't really his voice anymore. It sounded older, like many voices speaking together. "They need a new guardian. The old minister can't hold them back anymore. They chose me." The lake water began swirling around our feet, and in its reflection, I saw something that will haunt me forever, an entire town under the surface, with people walking the streets like they were still alive. And they were all looking up at us, reaching out with pale hands. I did the only thing a father could do. I ran back to the trailer and grabbed the folder from the library. There had to be something, anything, that could help us. While Betty held on to Tommy, who was getting colder by the minute, I frantically flipped through the old papers. Then I found it, the minister's last diary entry. "Only a family's love, stronger than the lake's hunger, can break the chain. The price is facing the depths together." The water was up to our knees now. Our trailer started creaking, like something was pulling it towards the lake. Sarah was crying, and Mike had his arms around her, trying to be brave. "We have to go in," I said, my voice shaking. "All of us. Together." Betty looked at me like I was crazy. "Into the lake, Howard? We'll drown." "Trust me," I whispered, even though I was terrified myself. "We have to trust each other. It's the only way to save Tommy." The lake water was swirling around us now, and those voices were getting louder. Through the dark water, I could see the church spire glowing beneath us, and shadows moving inside it. "Hold hands," I ordered, forming a circle around Tommy. "Don't let go, no matter what happens." We waded deeper into the lake, the cold water rising to our waists, then our chests. Tommy's eyes were completely black now, but he wasn't fighting anymore. He was crying, real tears, not lake water. "They're so sad, Dad," he whispered in his normal voice. "They've been trapped here so long." Just then, the water pulled us under. I could feel hands grabbing at my legs, trying to separate us. Through the murky water, I saw faces. So many faces. Children, adults, all reaching for us, their mouths open in silent screams. But we didn't let go. We held on tighter, pulling Tommy close as we sank deeper and deeper into the lake's dark heart. We were drowning, but still holding hands. The cold was unbearable. Through the dark water, I saw the church getting closer, a massive shadow below us. The faces of the townspeople were all around us now, their hands reaching, pulling. Then Tommy started speaking underwater, his voice somehow clear as day. "They want to be free," he said. "They've been waiting for someone to set free." Suddenly, an old man in a minister's clothes appeared in front of us. His face was sad, and his eyes were just like Tommy's now, dark as the lake itself. He reached out and touched Tommy's forehead. "Will you take my place, child?" the minister's voice echoed in our heads. "Will you guard them?" "No," Betty screamed without making a sound. "He's our son." That's when I understood. They didn't want to hurt Tommy, they wanted him to become their new guardian. But they needed our permission, our sacrifice. My lungs were burning. Sarah had stopped struggling. Mike's grip was getting weaker. We were running out of time. "We love you," I thought as hard as I could, looking at Tommy. "We'll always love you, but you have to choose." Tommy looked at the minister, then at us. For a moment, his eyes cleared. "I choose my family," he said. A bright light exploded from the church windows. The faces around us started to fade, like old photographs washing away. The minister smiled, a real, kind smile this time. "You've broken the chain," he said. "Love really is stronger than ancient hunger." The water started pushing us up, gently now. As we rose, I saw the townspeople below, waving goodbye. They were smiling too, finally at peace. We broke the surface, gasping for air. The lake was calm now, normal. When we dragged ourselves to shore, the sun was rising. Tommy was shivering, but his eyes were his own again. "They're free now," he whispered before falling asleep in Betty's arms. "They're finally free." We packed up and left Blackwater Lake that same morning. Nobody tried to stop us. Even Jake at the bait shop just nodded when we drove past, like he knew. The strange thing is, when we developed Betty's camera roll later, all the scary pictures were gone. Instead, there was just one new photo that none of us remembered taking. It showed the lake at sunrise, and in the water's reflection, you could see the old town, but this time it was peaceful. No dark shapes, no reaching hands. Just a quiet town sleeping under the waves. Tommy recovered quickly, though he didn't remember much. Sometimes when he's sleeping, he still hums those old hymns from the 1920s. And every now and then, on rainy nights, our faucets drip a little more than they should. Last week, I read in the newspaper that Blackwater Lake has become one of the safest lakes in the Adirondacks. No more drownings, no more missing children. The water is clearer now, they say, and people have started seeing fish again. But we've never gone back. Some things are better left undisturbed. Sarah still won't go swimming anywhere. Mike became a history teacher, specializing in forgotten towns. Betty put away her camera and never took it out again. As for me, I can't hear church bells without remembering that night. Tommy's 15 now. Sometimes I catch him staring at glasses of water, like he's looking for something. When I ask him about it, he just smiles and says, "They're happy now, Dad. That's all that matters. We don't talk much about what happened at Blackwater Lake. Who would believe us anyway? But every year, on the anniversary of that night, we all hold hands at dinner. Just to remind ourselves that love really is stronger than any darkness, even the kind that lives at the bottom of a hungry lake.